Hello, and welcome to the Enjoy the Book of Life audio library. Pictures in the Book of Acts, or The Unfinished Work of Jesus, by David Anderson Barry. Chapter 9. Jesus, the Beginning and the Ending. Jesus, Acts 17, verse 7, and Acts 18, 5 and 28. All roads lead to Rome. What is proverbial is not always practical, but in Paul's day, all roads led to Rome. For what led elsewhere did not deserve the name of road. Since he saw the vision and heard the cry of, "Come over into Macedonia and help us," in Troy, he and his companions have been trudging along the great highway that ran from the Orient to Rome, called Via Egnatia, or Ignatian Way. In Britain, we still have the remains of these Roman roads, for they were all well made, well kept, and well measured. In Rome stood the golden milestone, and the itineraries are still in existence that give us the mileage of these great ways that wandered over hill and dale, linking up town with town, city with city, province with province, and all with the central unit, the city of Rome. Thus we know how Paul left Philippi. He took the way that went westward, past the simple meeting place where he first talked to Lydia, underneath the Arch of Triumph, over the river Gagnites, across the plain, until, 33 miles farther on, he with his fellow travelers entered Amphipolis, a beautiful town lying like our Hampshire Christchurch, encircled by two rivers, hence its name. The position was not only beautiful, but its history was romantic. Years before, another Paul, Paulus Emilius, who had just won the battle of Pydna, here publicly proclaimed that the Macedonians should be free. Now here comes another Paulus, no victorious general he, clad in all the panoply of war and elated by a well-won victory, but an ugly little Jew, poor, rough in speech, accompanied by two other men and a youth of the peasant class. Reading his magnificent writings and knowing what he is, it is hard for us to picture to ourselves what he really looked like. Judging by the descriptions he gives himself throughout his writings, I quite believe that if you and I had been loitering about the eastern gate of Amphipolis in the cool of the evening and hearing the tramp, tramp, shuffle, shuffle sounds that betoken feet and limbs wearied by a long march, and looked up, we should have perceived not by the eyes of the flesh save 4 men of somewhat doubtful appearance. Probably, had we been keen observers, we should have noticed that at least 2 had been in a scuffle, and perceived that their garments smelt of prison. So hard is it to judge by the outward appearance what the inner, the real man is. Yet, here was the greater Paul with a nobler message of freedom. It is the custom to smile at the dictum for which so many died more than 100 years ago, that all men are equal, that all men are brethren, and that all men are free. It sounds true, but it does not seem true, for in America, whose Declaration of Independence enshrines the statement, all men are equal, freedom alone, nothing more, is granted the black man, and even that only after a sea of blood has been shed. Why is this? Because the gospel alone makes men, brethren, equal, free. Paul did not stay at Amphipolis. Why, we are not told, save that there was no synagogue there. Another 30 miles and they reach Apollonia, surrounded by streams and lakes, whilst the rising ground on every side is clad with verdure and crowned with trees. Here again there is no synagogue, and no stay is made. Once more they trudge along the Egnatian way, which here leads them through a deep pass, the sides of which are clothed with forest trees, amidst which, leading off from each side of the road, are mossy dells with tinkling brooks, inviting the weary traveler to rest and bathe his blistering feet, for it is 37 long miles ere the next town be reached. As the lengthening shadows tell of dying day, they at last issue from the narrow glen. The magnificent is the view that meets their eyes. Yonder the blue waters of the Aegean, repeating in every wave the crimson and gold of the setting sun. In the right, the deep purple of the mountains famed in classic story. In front, the noble plain of Axius, and yonder, yes, yonder, are seen the towers and turrets of the free city of Thessalonica. Philippi was named by King Philip after himself. The day his daughter was born, he won a battle, and so he named her Thessalonica. Thessalonica grew up and in due course married Cassander, one of her brothers. Alexander the Great he was, generals. Now Cassander fell into ill health, and after trying various means he was cured by bathing in the hot springs that gave his name to Therma. Grateful, he embellished the little town and changed its name from Therma to Thessalonica, his wife's name. Hence, on its coin is to be seen the figure of victory, and the name and place are with us today, for Salonika is a well-known seaport with about 100,000 Jews. I have dwelt on this, for is there not something appropriate in addressing the epistle which sounds the note of contest with the great world powers to those fond of horses, remembering the symbolism of the horse, Zechariah 1 and Revelation 6, and the meaning of the word Philippians, whilst the letters to the Thessalonians, or those who have won the victory, are filled with the glory of the believer's hope. As we have already seen, although Paul found here a flourishing synagogue, he was soon driven from the city by the malignant madness of those who would neither have Jesus to be the true Messiah, that is, Jehovah's anointed, Psalm 2, 1 and 6, nor suffer the Gentiles to be saved. Clearly, the magistrates took bail of Jason and his associates that Paul would not return to the city. To this effective action on the part of the politarchs and the Demas, the richly populated region of Achaia owed Paul presents for 2 years, and he was intensely desirous of revisiting Thessalonica, where he had met with much success and had left many eager students of the word, but young in the faith. Thus writing to them, he says, "Wherefore we would have come unto you, even I, Paul, once and again, but Satan hindered us." Years before this, Cicero, in his impeachment of Piso for gross maladministration of the province, depicts him in a very vivid passage, slinking into Thessalonica by night. But there, he proceeds, he found no rest from the wails of the oppressed and the clamor of the injured, so he left the main road and fled to the obscure town of Berea. So Paul leaves the Egnatian way, and traveling 50 miles, reaches Berea, a little town quite off the track of traffic and in a different division of Macedonia. Not from cowardice did he do this, for arriving at Berea, he immediately searches out the synagogue and begins his labors afresh. If he imagined he had escaped from the intense antagonism of the Thessalonian Jews, he forgot what he was ever reminding others of, his own fanatical exertions before his conversion. No sooner did they hear of the success that was following the apostles' labors than along these 50 miles of hilly highway came feet swift to shed blood. Again, the same successful tactics are pursued. Again, the apostle has to flee. What a life this man spends! Preaching by day, persecuted always, fleeing by night, he knows no rest. Before Paul knew Jesus, he gave himself no rest. Since then, no rest is given to him. Paul flees, and the words descriptive of his flight are very pathetic. And then immediately the brethren sent away Paul to go as it were to the sea, but Silas and Timothy abode there still. And it is added, but those conducting Paul brought him unto Athens. Notice, conducting Paul, leading him along. Those brethren were to go as far as the sea. So runs the best reading. You can see it all, can't you? The feeble Jewish artisan, with the wounds inflicted at Philippi scarce skinned over, with his feet sore and his heart heavy, whilst his sight is so affected that the very signing of his name is a feat, and his writing so large that it almost stares a blind man out of countenance. Galatians 6:2. He is brought by the brethren of Berea to Dium, only 16 miles away, with such difficulty that they cannot find it in their hearts to wave him adieu from the quay, but, compelled by pity, accompany him on board and never leave him until they see him safely landed at Athens, a 6 days' sail if the wind be favorable. So it happens that the shepherd feeding his flock on the mountainside above the lovely vale of Tempe sees a white-winged craft disappear into the azure depths of the sunlit sea, and heaves a sigh of relief, for 'tis the vessel bearing away the loved but somewhat reckless servant of the Lord from the intemperate violence of the mob. As the vessel is wafted on, the majestic snow-crowned mass of Olympus, which, but for the apostles' coming, they had believed was the very dwelling place of the gods, comes into view, and on the left they pass the field of Marathon, where the proud hosts of Persia were hopelessly broken, and Greece, according to Daniel's prophecy, became the third great world power. On the white wings bear them, the rounding the lofty cape of Sunium, they espy the white shrine of Athens, glittering on its summit. The helm shifted, the ship has Salamis under her prow, Salamis, the Trafalgar of its day, and now, rounding the last white promontory, the voyagers see before them a landlocked bay surrounded by busy wharfs, backed by a level plain broken about 3 miles off by a rock, like that of Stirling, crowned with buildings, among which something that flashed and glittered catches their eyes. It is the Acropolis, and the glittering object is the broad-headed spear and polished helmet of the idol, Athene Promachus, the guardian goddess of the Athens that crouched beneath. The wharves of those of Piraeus, which is united with Athens by 2 lofty walls enclosing a considerable tract of ground, covered with small houses which line the broad road that leads to Athens. This broad strip of inhabited territory leads the eye to 4 eminencies outlined against the wooded background of Mount Lycabettus. The hill to the apostles' right is that of the Muses, or the Museum. Next to it is the hill crowned with temples and Athens' great image, the Acropolis. Beyond this, but lower, is the Areopagus, or Mars Hill, whilst quite to the left is the Pnyx, and in the hollows between these 4 heights lies Athens, the eye of Greece, mother of arts and eloquence. Get this well before your mind's eye, and it will help you understand the apostles' movements in the city. We do not need to draw upon our imagination, which would be quite out of place in such a connection, for another traveler visits Athens about this time, and having no message for the souls of men, he had plenty of attention to give to the environment. As he marched along between those walls, he tells us he saw many idols, and amongst them altars dedicated to God unknown. That this was not an infrequent inscription amongst idolaters, we learn from what a seer did at Rome. A plague had broken out. Prayers and sacrifices had failed. What was to be done? The seer ordered a flock of black and white sheep to be driven forth from the capital, and wherever one lay down, there they were to erect an altar and sacrifice to the unknown God who had been offended by their neglect of him. So, doubtless one of the brethren, as they conducted the apostle to the Periac gate, pointed out such an altar with this inscription, "To an unknown God." And now, bidding his faithful guides farewell, and giving them many messages to the dear friends at Thessalonica, he enters Athens. Around him, above him, before him, on this side and that, bearing the names of streets, pointing the way where roads met, were idols. Petronius, with a curl of his lip, once said that in Athens it was easier to find a god than a man. So there were idols large and idols small, idols singly and idols in groups, idols of wood, metal, earthenware, ivory, marble, plain and colored, idols by famous sculptors, and the reverse, idols contemplative, smiling, frowning, fighting, dancing, and threatening, idols on pedestals, in shrines, starting from caves, standing as sentinels in long lines, idols in fact innumerable, for Pausanias said that there were more gods in Athens than in all the rest of Greece put together. Not only were there idols, but there were statues. Had Paul known it, he could have looked upon the beautiful Bernice in stone ere he looked upon her in the flesh. There stood Augustus, here Hyrcanus, the Jewish high priest. Not only were there idols and statues, but there were philosophers who held them in derision somewhat secretly, for Socrates had lost his life through having mocked at them. So here, under Mars Hill, Paul passed the Stoa Posile, or painted cloister, where Zeno founded his school of philosophy, hence called Stoic, whilst not far off, on the other side of the hill, was the garden where Epicurus taught, and which he left in trust for the use of his disciples, so named Epicurean. Thus, whilst the flesh was everywhere with its religion, pride, and pleasure, lived in quarrelsome propinquity. What effect had all these philosophers on religion? None, save to add to the number of idols. For the Athenians, impressed by their doctrine of the abstract, erected images to pity, energy, modesty, and fame. How plain to us, then, are Paul's feelings as he wandered through the streets of Athens, waiting the advent of Silvanus and Timothy, for whom he had so urgently sent, his spirit painfully excited, hence our word, paroxysm, seeing the city being full of idols. Not only so, but when he sought to proclaim Jesus and the resurrection to the curious Athenians, they were greatly excited as they thought, "Here are two new gods," for they would of a surety take Jesus to be a god and the resurrection to be a goddess. From this excitement it came about that, seizing him by the arm, they led him up the hill by the same steps that we can climb today. Up from the marketplace scrambled a host of curious folk, accompanied by numbers of sneering philosophers from the Stoa and the Garden. Now the top of the hill called Mars, for tradition had it that here Mars was judged for the murder of Neptune's son, was cut out into rows of seats in semicircular fashion. At one end of the semicircle, or let us call it at the tip of one horn of the half moon, stood a stone upon which the accuser stood, called the stone of insolence, whilst at the tip of the other horn stood another on which the accused stood, called the stone of impudence. On this stone, then, stands Paul the Apostle under the shadow of the Acropolis, crowned by the magnificent Parthenon or Virgin's house, in the innermost apartment of which was the olive wood image of Athene, said, like the ill-shapen one of Diana at Ephesus. And to have fallen down out of heaven, he stands just where Socrates stood 4 centuries before to be condemned for manifesting the uselessness of the gods. What will Paul say? What will be done to Paul? Number 1. Paul, as we would expect the man who wrote Romans 7:14 and 18 to be as courteous, he began, Men Athenians. Whatever else they differed in, they had this in common. They were men. And it is very helpful to all who would be preachers of the word to remember that those whom they address and whose heart they would win for Christ are men. Try and remember how thou didst feel when another once addressed thee. He was not able to compel either thy attention or thy acquiescence by taking it for granted that he was the speaker and thou wast hearer. Therefore, to thee what he said was as pearls of wisdom. The law gives to every dog his first bite, so we must give to each hearer his first yawn. But it is our fault if he yawn again, for that yawn has told its tale to the observant speaker. Perhaps, warned by the example of Eutychus, we must look to the ventilation of the hall or the length of our sermon. Or, instructed by that open mouth, we must open ours more widely. No, not to shout, but to pour forth a powerful stream of instructive matter. Perhaps we have been lingering in the backwaters of pleasant platitudes. Now it is time to let the audience hear the brawl of the broken brook as it dashes headlong amongst the rocks. As the old man said to the minister, who had suggested that he might take snuff to deliver him from drowsiness, Hence, sirs, pit the snuff in your sermon. We must remember, as the apostle does, that we are addressing men and not idyllic listeners by showing that we have been observing them. For not only did he call them men, but followed up by Athenians, whose life he had been observing. Number 2, Paul was the bearer of news. The New Testament word for gospel originally meant a present given in return for good news, then the sacrifice offered on the receipt of good news, and then the good news itself. So he came with news that was good. Now, if I can rivet an audience by telling them of the latest discoveries of science, shame on me if I let their attention wander when I tell them of the good news. Aye, shame on you, sir, as well. Why is it? I believe this paragraph will reveal it. Deeply interested in men, Paul had been closely studying the Athenians, and as a consequence, he had found out that with all their boasted knowledge, there was something they did not know. Passing along, he had read a confession of their ignorance in the altar inscription, "To an unknown God." So watch that accusing finger pointing to the far Pyrrhic road where on one shrine at least was inscribed the limitation of their knowledge. Here he encounters the Epicureans and Stoics. They were philosophers. The business of a philosopher is to learn what or who is behind this we call the universe, and learning it to instruct me, the ignorant one, the ignoramus, or, to use the Athenian altar word, the agnostic. For he to whom God is agnostic must himself be an agnostic. For in this matter it is only crass idiots that rush in and say, there is, or there exists, no God. The question quashes him at once. How do you know? For to make a universal denial is to claim universal knowledge. Now, there are two worlds in the universe, the world of matter and that of spirit, or as some would rather call it, of morals, which, after all, is just a more emphatic way of saying of spirit. For who would ascribe morality to a stock or stone, in other words, to matter? I may, like some of those philosophers, affirm that matter only exists, but the instant I use the little word ought, I am affirming that of which matter knows nothing. Thus, whatever philosophy a philosopher professed concerning the universe to the three questions concerning it, whence, what, whither, he must answer according to either his world of sense theory or his world of morals theory. Take, for instance, these Epicureans whom Paul is facing on Mars Hill. Their founder's world of sense theory was that the world is made up of atoms existing from eternity. See here how Paul's mention of the altar to God unknown crushes the Epicurean theory, that if the world of sense is atomic, the world of morals must be chaotic, from which chaos the sensuous alone emerges. Death is nothing to us, for what is dissolved is insensible, and what is insensible is nothing to us, was their favorite dictum, and what is sensuous is pleasure. Alas, it is very easy in a garden, contemplatively, to babble about atoms, and that the soul, being formed of them, let these be round and of a somewhat finer texture, had no consciousness after death, but was resolved into its atoms again. To declare by a flight of imagination that since we are nothing more save a collection of atoms which the breath of this charnel house disperses, so the summum bonum, the highest good, must be the greatest pleasure that may be enjoyed during the brief space of time that elapses betwixt the two non-entities. But, as Aulus Gellius tells us, that the ancient Romans, alarmed by an earthquake, prayed not to any of the gods individually, but to God in general, as to the unknown. So it is when some poor soul, coming amid the stress of life to meet death, with all its hopes and stays shaken to their foundations, then it is, as perchance at the grave of some sweet child, that love cries out for immortality. Then is tumbled into a heap to be swept away all the cobweb logic spun in pleasant hours spent in the garden of pleasure. Then the despairing soul, clad in the Nicias robe of doubt, erects an altar to God unknown, beyond the gate of learning and of logic. Can atoms love atoms? Or does it comfort one writhing in the agony of parting with what has been its star and sun to whisper in his ear, "Man, why grieve thus over what was but a cluster of atoms? Up, up, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." Zeno of the Stoa made a further advance, for he said, "Let power be granted and call it God." For he taught, saying, that whatever is real is material. Matter and force are the two ultimate principles. Matter in itself is motionless and unformed, though capable of receiving all motions and all forms. Force is the active, moving, and molding principle. It is inseparably joined with matter. The working force in the universe is God. Hence, God is the world, and the world is God. So the human soul is but an emanation from God and is destined to be finally reabsorbed in him. Thus the poet quoted by Paul was a Stoic, for Cleanthes wrote in his hymn to Jupiter this line, "For we thine offspring are." It is true that a fellow countryman of Paul, Aratus the Cilician, uses the same expression in the opening of his poem. Doth care perplex? Is lowering danger nigh? We are his offspring, and to Jove we fly. This being Zeno's doctrine as to the world of sense, what does he say of the world of morals? This, surely, that as all things are God, so all things must be good, that there is neither pleasure nor pain, for to the wise man all things are alike, for to reason they are alike good. For as God is but the reason of the world, hence not its creator, but only its organizer, pleasure could be no good, and pain no evil. The outcome of which is that the wise man is the man who bears all things with equanimity, knowing that he is superior to all the events of life, seeing that, having the power of putting an end to his life, he possesses the power of returning to God at any time. Thus Zeno, Cleanthes, Cato, Seneca, and Brutus were all Stoics, and all suicides. These, with all the others, be they Peripatetics, Platonists, Sophists, or what not, discredited the gods, for they disbelieved that they could make the world, but all their searching into the question, how did this world come into being, brought them no nearer to him of whom Paul said, "Who made the world and all the things that are in it, he of heaven and earth, the Lord being." 4 centuries before, Socrates stood where Paul stands and begins in the same fashion, "Ye men of Athens," and in his eloquent defense says, "Let us take the accusation." It runs to this effect: Socrates hath violated the laws by corrupting the youth, and by acknowledging not the gods whom the city acknowledge, but other strange deities. After expatiating on the principles upon which he had trained the youth, he proceeds, "If you were to say to me, Socrates, we acquit you, but on this condition only, that you abandon your former courses, but if you are again detected in them, you die. Ye men of Athens, I am obliged to you, and thank you, but I must obey God rather than you. This which hath befallen me will, I doubt not, turn out a blessing, and it cannot be that their opinion is right who esteem death to be evil. The dead are more happy than the living, both in other respects, and thenceforth they die no more forever, if at least we may believe what is said of them." Then, after beseeching his judges seated there on Mars Hill to corrupt his own sons as he had corrupted theirs, that is, by instilling into them these principles, he adds, "And now the hour is come for us to depart. I go to death, and you to life, but which of the twain is the better choice is known only to God." Condemned by a great majority, this noblest of heathens descends to prison and death. All are agreed that never lived a wiser pagan, but his words emphasize sharply the world's need for a revelation, and the marvelous beauty of Paul's words spoken from the same spot, to seek the Lord, if perhaps they might feel after him and might find him, though indeed not far from each one of us he is. Socrates' speech is a marvelous tour de force. Paul's is a revelation. The climax. Never preach a sermon without a climax. Never trouble an audience with anything that lacks a climacteric. Paul has been busy constructing his world of sense doctrine. Now he comes to his world of morals. If God is creator, then he is Lord of all, and the ignorance of man concerning this is the root of all evil. Therefore, God now charges all men everywhere to repent, to think as the result of perceiving or observing. Hence, there is implied in the combination the two elements of time and change. That is to say, there is a change of mind followed by a change of conduct, but the former must precede the latter. For in the former lies latent that energy which becomes kinetic or work-producing when brought to bear upon conduct or manner of life. This was then, and still is, a new philosophy. To think his thoughts of ourselves after him is necessary before we can become imitators of God. I said, is new, for the everyday philosophy of life is that of Naaman's. I thought. Not much difference, you say. No, only the new is the change of the emphasis from I to thought, which makes as great a difference in our spiritual science as did Galileo's discovery that our astronomical system is not geocentric, earth-centered, but heliocentric, sun-centered. In the science of astronomy, we cease to be self-centered, we start being God-centered. Ah, this is the greatest objection of thousands to the gospel. It is of faith unto faith, not of reason upon reason. Still, God is charging every man everywhere to repent, because he set a day in which he is about to judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he appointed, this proof having given to all, having raised him from among the dead. Dr. Arnold said that there is no historical fact so strongly attested as the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Thus Paul reaches his climax, for he has reached Jesus. All has been preparatory for his appearance on the stage of the address. Each fact, observation, quotation has been marshaled so that the mind's eye is led to the solitary figure, Jesus, Jesus only. Hark, what sounds are these that break the judicial calm of the place? Ha ha, ho ho, ha ha. For it is written, and when they heard of the resurrection from among the dead, some mocked. Mocked. One reads what an Indian missionary has written. This has been one of the worst nights I ever endured. Mockery, mockery, cruel mockery, almost unbearable. I talked for a while and was heard by some on the blessings to be enjoyed by faith in Christ, when a man came with a hell-hardened countenance and that peculiar constant laugh which I can hardly bear. The burden of his cry was, Juggernaut is the foundation. Juggernaut is completely God. Victory to Juggernaut. He clapped his hands, he shouted, he laughed, and induced the rest, or a great part of them, to do the same. On the ground of reason I fear no one. The rage I commonly bear very well, but these everlasting buffoons are nearly too much for me. It is my own great care that amidst a reviling, laughing crowd, I do not seem abashed. Yes, mocking laughter will do what nothing else will do. It will kill where reason cannot convince, and obliterate what persecution cannot destroy. Lost is many a man's soul because, alas, the devil knew better than to reason with him or persecute him, because he laughed at Christ until the man laughed with him. So as Paul stepped down from the stone of impudence, he was followed by mocking laughter, and with bland assurances, "We will hear thee again concerning this." They laughed at him never again. They heard him concerning this never more. Paul stayed in Athens over a month, but I never read of him addressing these cultured Athenians again. Persecuted, beaten, imprisoned, stoned, tortured, harried, pursued, and maligned, Paul is accustomed to all these things, and where he endures most, there he returns oftenest. But to the one solitary place where he was laughed at, he never returns. He never sends a message. He never writes a letter. In all the apostles' writings, it is as if it had never been. Beware lest thou come into the same condemnation. Thou art learned, thou art eloquent. To thee life has given many gifts, and to thee many honors have come. Thou hast never been openly immoral. Lust, intemperance, and many more such have had no part in thy well-ordered life. Such a woman as Mary the Magdalene or Damaris the Athenian is an offense to thy artistic soul. Nay, even Dionysus the Areopagite would have been no more than a nodding acquaintance of thine, for thou art liberal, broad-minded, disinclined to judge thy fellows harshly. Bigotry, puritanism, narrowness of soul, that must always be dividing the world into twain, saved and unsaved, are as distasteful to thee as a wrong note or a harsh color is discordant. Thou wouldest not even permit thyself Huxley's liberty in ostentatiously tearing up a tract handed to him. Thou mightest laugh, or say thank you. To a gospel invitation thou wouldest answer, "Another time I'll hear thee." And when one with beating, breaking heart would speak to thee of Jesus, of his cross, of his resurrection, and of his coming again, thy politeness freezes the words on his lips. But if he speaks to thee of repentance, ha ha, repentance forsooth. Friend, let Athens speak to thee. Had Paul ever climbed the Acropolis and stood at the feet of Athens, then, through the clear atmosphere of Greece, he would have seen yonder to the southwest a peak 2,000 feet high, casting its shadow across a narrow neck of land, lapping on either hand by the shining sea. That peak is the Acro-Corinthus, upon which stood the temple of Venus, and at whose base nestled the town of Corinth, whilst the narrow neck was the isthmus, or bridge of the seas, the scene of the Isthmian games, to the manner of conducting which Paul refers in his letter to the Corinthians. Looking at your map, you will see that Greece ends in a piece of land shaped somewhat like a mulberry leaf, hence its name Morea, and joined to the mainland by a fine stalk, the isthmus. From the place where this stalk joins the leaf rose a huge rock, like Dumbarton Rock, but far loftier. In the morning it cast its shadow over the town of Corinth, and in the afternoon over the isthmus. Now, on the side of the isthmus, looking toward Jerusalem, was a busy seaport, the town of Centrea, Romans 16, verse 1, whilst on the side looking Romewards was the port of Lycaeum. This latter, but a mile and a half distant, was united to Corinth by double lines of fortifications similar to those that united the Piraeus to Athens, whilst on the other hand Centrea was distant 8.5 miles. Not only so, but crossing this isthmus saved a voyage of 500 miles, a stormy 500, for rounding Cape Malea, the southmost extremity of the mulberry leaf, was to the ancients what rounding the Cape of Good Hope was to our sailors in Nelson's days. So you can imagine that crossing the isthmus was a matter of importance. Hence, they made a ship railway, by which ships were lifted out of the water at Centrea, run on rollers across the land, and launched anew at Lycaeum. In fact, to use a Canadian term, it was a huge portage. Nero tried to be the Lesseps of his day and attempted to dig a canal across. You will thus be prepared to learn that Corinth, with its 2 ports, was the shipbuilding center of the East. There was built the good ship Argo, which sailed unknown seas under Jason, its captain, whose sailors were called after their ship, the Argonauts, to find the Golden Fleece. The first great warships were also built at Corinth. Therefore, what with the building of ships, the transporting of ships, the sailing of ships, the loading and unloading of ships, Corinth, or as it was called, the city of the 2 seas, was a busy place. Glasgow, London, Paris, Vienna, all rolled into one, and the essence extracted what essence would make Corinth. Where trade abounded, there did luxury abound, and where luxury abounded, there did vice much more abound. The very priests were panders, and the gorgeous temples haunt the horrid cruelties and nameless vices. From what we are told, I believe that Corinth, where met East and West, was worse than Sodom and Gomorrah 20 times over, and thither in due season Paul came. Whatever way he took, he arrived in this city, where he was going to spend the next 2 years of his busy life. He entered it alone and unknown. Here he met Syrians with their gay garments, Romans with their marital step, and Greeks with their affected gait, whilst Jews abounded on every hand. They were in specially great numbers, for Claudius had just banished them from Rome. Why? The decree incidentally mentioned by Luke is referred to by the Roman historian Suetonius, who writes, "The Jews, who were in a constant tumult, Chrestus being their leader, he banished from Rome." Now most scholars understand by Chrestus, Christ. Chrestus means good, whilst Christus means anointed. The former term would be easily understood by the Romans, and the latter by the Jews. Hence, doubtless, Suetonius's slight error. For him and his informants, there would appear to be some sense in having a leader called Chrestus, but none in calling him Christus. Here, then, is a testimony to the early planting of a church in Rome. Doubtless, the Jews pursued their usual course in arraigning the believers before the magistrates. They, like their compeers elsewhere, would not understand the complaints. Perhaps some citizen appealed to the emperor. At any rate, Claudius cut the Gordian knot by banishing all the Jews from his capital, and so got rid of their riotous mobs, goaded into madness because they could not find a pilot in Rome. Undaunted, the lonely man found his way to the synagogue. There the various guilds sat by themselves, whilst the women peeped behind the lattice-work. A weaver of the coarse black hair of the Sicilian goats, he took his place amongst the workers in that commodity, and soon found himself going home with Aquila and Priscilla, and in the workroom in their dwelling, packed away in some narrow alley, he approved himself a good workman worthy of his hire. There he earned his livelihood by long hours of monotonous toil. I dare say it was with difficulty that the apostle kept the wolf from the door, for the shadow of hard times lay heavy on the land just then. Yet the stream of merchandise flowed on. Carpets from Babylon, papyrus from Egypt, gums and fragrant balsams from Arabia, dyes from Asia, ivory from Africa, wool from Laodicea, and slaves from Libya. And as Paul visited the wharfs in search of material for his labor, doubtless he heard the well-known accents of his native place, and entered into conversation with some sailor or trader from Tarsus. We know not whether the cool breeze off the beautiful blue waters of the Gulf or the busy scene of healthful toil refreshed the jaded apostle, but we do know that the servants of shameless vice, holding their heads high, for there to be vicious was to be religious, must have met him at every crossing, and appalled by hideous crime and dazzled by ostentatious luxury, he must have crept back to his room in that alley with his chaste soul quivering. There was one thing that kept him patiently enduring, and that was that blessed thing called work. How often had hard labor prevented the mind from breaking down under an intolerable strain? Wise were these Jews of old, whose rabbis taught that he who did not teach his son a trade made him a thief. Hillel, Paul's teacher, was a woodcutter. His great rival in learning, Shammai, was a carpenter, whilst of one of the greatest of the rabbis it is recorded that he discoursed to his students from the top of a cask of his own making, which each day he carried to the classroom. True, in the ministry of the word, the laborer is worthy of his hire, a fact we too oft overlook. But happy is that laborer who can support himself and lay himself under no obligation to unwilling professors of Christianity. Thus was Paul able to write to these Corinthians in a different strain from that in which he wrote to the fine old soldiers at Philippi. And when I was present with you and wanted, I was chargeable to no man. For that which was lacking to me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied, and in all things I have kept myself from being burdensome unto you, and so will I keep myself. So one day, when the apostle was wondering what was going to happen to him, there came two strangers asking in the alley for Paul of Tarsus. Two shadows darkened the threshold of the door, and looking up he saw Silas and Timothy. What joy, what gladness, what fresh energy was imparted to the drooping Paul. Maybe that night they sat up until the morning came, and the shadows fled away, and the new day dawned on Corinth, talking about their experiences in Asia and in Europe, and in showing the various gifts they brought, and repeating again and again all the dear messages from the saints of God in distant Macedonia. It put new heart in the apostle. He had been arguing in the synagogue and persuaded men to accept Jesus as the Messiah, but somehow it had all fallen flat. Like the old hero he was, Paul missed the grand stimulus of stones and curses, of rods and stocks. So he wrought at tents for shepherds and poor pilgrims from day to day, and helped Aquila and Priscilla to make them. What an opportunity for Aquila and Priscilla! What long talks about the Lord Jesus Christ and the Scriptures! No wonder these two in after days could instruct the eloquent Apollos. Prithee, brother, are you making the most of your opportunities? Paul might be low-spirited, but he was not mean-spirited. Freely he had received, so freely he passed on the knowledge to his fellow laborers at the loom and the board. So click-clack might go the loom as the coarse black hair became cloth. Snip-snap might go the scissors as Priscilla's deft fingers shaped gores and flaps. Stitch, stitch flew the shining needles as all three sat on the board running up the seams. But all the while came answer to question as these two learned the sacred truths from the lips of the apostle to the Gentiles. But the advent of Silvanus and Timothy altered all this. Immediately, we read, Paul was pressed in the word, not spirit. Another wonderful word this. Luke 12:50. How am I straitened until it be accomplished? 2 Corinthians 5:14. For the love of Christ constraineth me. Philippians 1:23. For I am in a strait betwixt two. The picture in the word is of a man walking along a path between two walls by which he is held together, so that he can turn neither to the right nor left, nor even turn back. If a lion was in the way, he could not help himself, he must go on. Like the fisher who was playing a fine fish in one of the American rivers, he came to a place where the path along the stream rose somewhat with a steep slope on one side and the bank falling precipitously into the rushing torrent on the other. Here at a sudden turn he came upon a bear. As was walking east, Bruin was walking west, and the path was narrow. To neither side could he turn. To retreat he knew was fatal. So fixing his gaze on the bear, he marched steadily towards him. Bruin stopped and contemplated the oncomer, who advanced without hesitation. Then suddenly, turning, he disappeared, and was no more seen. So Paul is on a path that presently will bring him face to face with the maddest and most malignant passions of his countrymen. The passage half suggests that Paul had been in a familiar Scots phrase, cain canny, but Silvanus and Timothy are now with him. He sensed the fray from afar, and the very next words tell us how he set a match to the magazine. He ceased to reason and persuade. He began to testify that Jesus is the Messiah. And then came the curses, the blasphemies, and the expulsion from the synagogue. Presently, we shall see how he was allowed to set up a meeting place adjoining the very synagogue itself. But see, the moment of separation was the moment of blessing. Crispus, one of the rulers, there were generally two, Sosthenes was the other. But he had to do the devil's work and undergo the humiliation that is the devil's reward for faithful service, before he shared the joy of Crispus, was converted with all his house, and it is added, many of the Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized. How magnificent! God's order, hearing, then believing, then being baptized. Why, there is much more said about being baptized than about breaking bread, and for this reason it is much more agreeable to take the Lord's Supper amidst the quietude of a gathering of fellow saints who all see the same as to its importance. It is much more difficult for flesh and blood to be immersed in a tank of cold water, or in a river, or in the sea before an assemblage of people, many of whom look upon it as a show or view with disapprobation your, what they call, making a fool of yourself, It was no light matter for these ascetic Corinthians to undergo publicly this ordinance. The one thing that might have ameliorated the harshness of the ordinance was that the apostle himself should baptize them. To the Greek mind, this would gild the act of obedience, yet this is not granted them. Paul, as in the matter of money, sees through them and refuses to lead them away from the fact that baptism is a public profession of a man or a woman's faith in a rejected Savior, and therefore that it is not pleasant to the natural man. I know this, for this lesson the Lord made me learn myself, that my beloved teacher, John McVicker, was going to baptize me, smoothed for me the pathway of obedience. Suddenly he developed lumbago, and I was baptized by one whose doing it would probably have prevented my submitting to the ordinance had I known in time. And yet the blessing came. It was in itself an ordeal, and from the changed circumstances it became a great ordeal. Yet the Lord graciously led my mind away to himself until I came to feel that for him I could go through fire and water. It at once had its simplicity as an act of obedience restored to it. Man had no share in my obedience. I was the Lord's disciple. How is it that the storm of Jewish passion did not break upon the devoted apostle for 18 months? True, the prospect of it and the state of the town must still have weighed greatly upon his mind, for we read that in a vision the Lord said to him, "Fear not, but speak and be not silent, because I am with thee, and no one shall set on thee to ill treat thee, because there is to me much people in this city." The answer is plainly before us in Luke's description, and from what we know from contemporary records, because the Jews, being under the ban of the emperor, were out of favor with the Corinthian mob, and the governor was an anti-Semite. The political history of Corinth is intricate. Under Augustus, it was under the Senate, hence ruled by the proconsul. Under Tiberius, it was under the emperor, and ruled by the propraetor. In the 4th year of Claudius, matters were reversed, and until Nero it had a proconsul, whilst under Vespasian it had a propraetor again. All this we know by coins and contemporary records. Now, will Luke make a mistake? Very easy it would be for him to do so. In fact, wholly probable if, as some of the critics say, he lived a century or two later. No, Luke uses the exact term for the governor that then existed and ruled Corinth. He was a proconsul. Take a more striking instance. You will remember the case of Sergius Paulus, the governor of Cyprus. Luke calls him a proconsul. The historian of those times, Cassius, calls him a propraetor. Now, nobody thought that both might be right. Of course, the learned thought Luke must be wrong. We now know that both are right. Augustus exchanged Cyprus for another province that had become unruly and required troops. The emperor was the head of the army. The propraetor practically meant general. Thus, whilst Cassius was right in saying that Cyprus was an imperial province with a propraetor as governor, Luke was minutely correct, for by the time Paul, who was until then called Saul, had reached the island, the exchange had been made, and the province becoming senatorial, the noble Sergius Paulus had been sent as proconsul to rule over it. I am equally persuaded that every difficulty in the Bible, not arising from a wrong translation or an ignorance of Hebrew, is equally simple of elucidation if we had the facts before us, and not the products of some wise man's imagination. It is wonderful what a plentiful crop there is of these at present cumbering the ground. Here lies the great importance of the archaeological investigations that are, praise God, being carried on at this present time in Bible lands. Just as the gradual advance of science into the world of the unknown is cutting away with ruthless hand all the ground up which Haeckel and other antagonists of the Lord Jesus Christ have built with such perverse ingenuity their fortress of infidelity. In fact, materialists, at hoc genus homo, are today hopelessly outclassed. They are hopelessly behind the times. It is the simple believer that is so far ahead that scientists are just beginning to catch far off glimpses of what to him are familiar truths. Don't then let any blatant opposer of the gospel bear you down, or make you believe that your faith must be held apologetically. Why, about 2 years ago a man scoffed at me for believing such out-of-date doctrines. I asked him to tell me what better he had to offer me. He told me. I pointed out that his statements contained exploded theories. He asked me, had I read such and such books, and was mightily offended because I told him I had no time to study what was hopelessly out of date. Not long ago I met him again. He was in sore trouble, but thank God he did not offer me new lamps for old, like the wily merchant in the Arabian tale. I trust he is now walking in the light of him who 1900 years ago said, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. Oh, that the world were walking in his wake today. So there was the great day in Corinth. A new proconsul was coming. And as it happens, we know a great deal about this new proconsul. Gallio is one of 3 brothers, for Mark Seneca had 3 sons. Mark Novatus, who is our Gallio, because he had been adopted by Luke Gallio, Luke Seneca, the brilliant philosopher, and Mark Seneca, the Seneca of history and famous tutor of Nero, whose reward for his training was to order his murder later on. In fact, all the 3 brilliant brothers lost their lives under the reign of that murderous maniac, who began life by sticking pins through flies to laugh at their struggles, and ended it by crying and howling with fear, because Nemesis had come and die he must, yet like not the prick of a dagger. Some think that Seneca knew the apostle, because some of his epistles breathe the same lofty spirit as Paul's. He writes of his brother Gallio, whom every one loved too little, even he who loved him to the utmost. He speaks of him playfully as my Lord Gallio, because of his distinguished bearing, while Stratius, a poet, calls him that sweet Gallio. We learn that Gallio was of a consumptive tendency, and after his proconsulship in Corinth had to make a journey to Egypt for his health. By this and other facts, our best chronologist fixes his arrival at Corinth as being on the 4th of June, A.D. 53. There, his complaint, disposition, and reputation for being attentive to all have become already known. Here is the Jew's opportunity. The preceding proconsul seems to have had Pilate's keen intuition and insight into Jewish minds and methods without Pilate's unfortunate habits of cruelty that placed him at their mercy. Besides gloomy Tiberius, whom upstart Pilate feared, was dead, and Claudius, who banished the Jews from Rome, was not likely to listen to their plaints against an official of the Senate. That this was no light matter we know, because Cicero, the great Cicero himself, bowed before the influence of the Jews of Rome. But Gallio, sweet Gallio, of whom the stern philosopher brother writes, no mortal man is so sweet to any single person as he is to all mankind. This flower of pagan chivalry, this marvel of pagan curiosity, this triumph of pagan culture, a Roman with all a Roman's stateliness and sense of justice, yet a Greek with all of a Greek's flexibility and broad-mindedness. Here at last is a suitable subject for the exercise of all the skillful flattery and wily management that are the gifts alone of the sons of Jacob. Sure, may we not hear them saying in the synagogal council, "'Twill be most easy to turn and twist my Lord Gallio round our little finger." Thus one day the alley that had re-echoed the songs of redemption now reverberated the cries of revenge and shouts of destruction. Wild-eyed men invaded the quiet workroom, and the apostle was seized by a dozen hands. Well need the apostle recall the quiet night when, in the starlit garret, a holy form stands in vision by his poor pallet, and that voice he had heard outside Damascus saying, "I am Jesus whom thou persecutest," now says, "Fear not, I am with thee. No one shall set on thee to ill-treat thee." And as in all great crises, where our minds are left unclouded, memory recalls the past with undimmed clearness, so thus armed against all foes, Paul rises to go with these men. In their menacing eyes, murder is right, full plain, with a quiet peace ruling within his breast. In a Roman colony, at the very judgment seat of Roman majesty, as in Jerusalem, so in Corinth they dare not murder the apostate save judicially. So hear them howling through the streets, gathering momentum and fury, dragging Paul to the proconsular residence, outside which is the pavement, John 19:13, on which is set the curule chair, a bema, or foot above the common level. There set around are the insignia of Roman power. There stand the lictors with their axes bound round with rods. There march to and fro the Roman guard, their equipment jangling as they move or stand, still ready to salute the proconsul. Beyond the pavement, behind the curule chair, hangs a heavy curtain of crimson or purple. Suddenly a noise of shouting is heard. The soldiers stiffen into sudden attention. The lictors grasp tightens on their fasces, when round the corner comes an eastern mob, tearing, rushing, shouting, shaking their fiercely clenched fists at some unseen object that forms the nucleus of the crowd. Accompanying them is a slowly growing mob of another kind, clad in different garments, who seem to be viewing the first mob with increasing distaste, for the Greeks loved not the people their emperor had banned. Thus was invaded Gallio's pavement. A slight movement of the heavy drapery, a sound of presenting arms, and an elegant form appears clad in a white toga of the Roman senator, bordered with a narrow band of the patrician purple. A slight sign, and the Jews find their prisoner seized from them, so that they can no longer spit in his face or cast mud on his torn and ragged garments. They in return force Sosthenes in the front to make accusation against the prisoner, and the accusation was well constructed. Judaism was a religio licita, Christianity was not. Therefore, for Paul to seduce souls from Judaism and lead them to Christ was correctly enough an offense against the Roman laws. It was an act of majestas, or disloyalty to the emperor, therefore punishable by death. Hence the strategic strength of the Jews' position. This fellow is not in the original. It is not required a pointing of many fingers, a sudden upheaval of many fists into the air, a glaring of many eyes bloodshot with passion, a contemptuous spitting on the ground. This persuadeth men to worship God, contrary to the law. Roman, not Mosaic. It is a critical moment. I dare say Paul makes that vow in Centrea common among Jews in token of a great and marvelous deliverance in remembrance thereof. Bracing himself and drawing his breath, he begins his defense. His mouth is about to open with the beginning of some courteous salutation when, "Silence!" cry the ushers, and the elegant accents of Gallio are heard. They fall in chilling, icy tones on these thrice heated hearts. If, indeed, it were some illegality or wicked criminality, O Jews, according to reason, I should have borne with you. But if a question about a word and names and a law which is among you, ye will see to it yourselves. For a judge I of these things do not wish to be. What cutting irony! What a perfect intuition of their methods! See how he penetrates, as by a flash of lightning, their suggestio falsi. They would have him think that their zeal was all for the law of Rome. He brushes this aside and goes to the heart of the matter by putting it all down to bigoted zeal for a law which is among you. Thus the calm, cultured voice of Gallio, piercing the air, still agitated by the strife of angry passion, uttered words that fell like an icy douche upon the blazing fire of Jewish animosity. Would they dare to dispute this judgment? Ho, lictors, clear the court. He rises from the curule chair, and lifting the curtain's heavy folds, idly saunters back through the cool atrium where the tinkling fountains cools the air. A great noise from the pavement excites his curiosity. From some coign of vantage he views the scene. Driven off the pavement by the lictors, the Jews had fallen foul of the Corinthian mob. The Corinthians had seized their leader, Sosthenes, and, to the music of the wild wailing of his compatriots, were beating the solemn patriarch with rods borrowed from the laughing lictors. For once the biter is bit, and the ruler of the synagogue is beaten instead of the apostate Paul of Tarsus. An injustice, doubtless, but apparently there had been something offensive in the attitude of Sosthenes, a hint of that browbeating spirit before which Pontius Pilate quailed, and even Cicero grew pale. So with a careless laugh, Gallio once more turns away, and nothing about these things mattered to Gallio. He turns away, perchance to write a letter to his brother Seneca at Rome about his morning's experience on the pavement, to that brother whose spirit was so lofty and yet so humble that he was in the habit of dining with his slaves. Once his friends ventured to ask the Stoic why he did this extraordinary thing, to whom the philosopher replied, "I dine with certain of my slaves because I have learned to esteem them, and with the rest I dine because I wish to make them worthy of my esteem." I stay to ask, is it not so with my Lord? He takes us into his most blessed company, not because we are worthy, but that he might make us worthy. Does Gallio write to him of Paul? We know not. Yet but for that morning's work, Gallio had been nothing to the world today. Contact with the ugly little Jew ennobles not the Jew, who needed no ennobling, but the noble Roman, my Lord Gallio. So it is with all men. It is not what they do or are, but with whom they come in contact. One of our own poets has beautifully said of the rustics resting in unmarked graves, hands that the rod of empire might have swayed, but knowledge to their eyes her ample page, rich with the spoils of time, did ne'er unroll. Chill penury repressed their noble rage, and froze the genial current of the soul. Some village hemmed in, that, with dauntless breast, the little tyrant of his fields withstood. Some mute, inglorious Milton here may rest, some Cromwell guiltless of his country's blood. It is not the lot of most of us to come into contact with men who make history, and thus ourselves make history in our time. But we have come into contact with Jesus Christ, King of the ages, and this, not that, is immortality. It was with a glorious sense of triumph that the 70 turned with the news that they had struck heavy and successful blows at Satan. What said our Lord? Rejoice not, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Gallio never suspected that the poor, ragged, mud-bespattered prisoner, with his face covered with spittle, was the maker or breaker of his fortunes. Had he but heard Paul's defense, what might have happened? An equally noble Roman has written, Audi alteram partem. Here the other side. Had Gallio not been a Stoic, but had cared more for things undreamed of by such, he might have accompanied Paul to that death at Nero's hands, which awaited them both with a glad hope that he lacked in spite of his graces of figure and character. Do not then, I beg you, put the gospel on one side, because he who would draw thee to a view of Christ is poor in speech and ragged in style. After all, this world is not everything. A simple Scotsman, by long contact with men of affairs, came at last to accompany the first place in the kingdom. But at the zenith of his fortunes, death smote his wife, and after his royal master had kindly bidden him be comforted as he followed the coffin with him, the first time the monarch had attended personally on such an occasion in a subject's case, the poor old man burst into tears, and amidst his sobs they heard him say, I used to tell her everything. Now I have no one to tell anything to. His place, his honors, his king's favor, had turned to dust and ashes at death's touch. All that a long and successful career has done for him is to leave him alone. But Paul has the word still burning in his breast, Fear not, for I am with thee. And at the close of his long and glorious career, we find that he is not alone, although no man stood with me, but all forsook me. Notwithstanding, the Lord stood with me and strengthened me. For, after all, this deliverance at Corinth is but one escape more nearer than final tragedy at Rome. On the night of the 19th July, AD 64, a fire broke out in the Circus Maximus that soon threatened to leave Rome but a heap of smoking ruins. And whilst it was raging, Nero stood on Mechanus Tower singing the fall of Troy and strumming an accompaniment on his everlasting guitar. He had gone too far. Public opinion was roused, and being suspected of causing the fire for his own pleasure, Nero began to fear lest he should lose his throne. It is supposed that the prefect Tigellinus, a creature still more base than himself, whispered in his ear, "The Christians." Thus began the great persecution under Nero, in which thousands of Christ's servants perished by the most dreadful deaths. Some wrapped in terry cloths were tied to posts, and when darkness fell they were lit as torches to display the splendor of Nero's entourage and the deftness of his driving, of which he was inordinately proud. Some wrapped in wild beast skins were thrown to hungry hounds to be torn to pieces before multitudes of men and women who showed no pity because they believed these Christians were the incendiaries that had brought no end of disasters upon their city. Others were beaten by lictors with their rods until unconsciousness supervened, when they were hacked to death with axes bound up in the rods, and Paul, as a Roman citizen, escaped the pain, the horror, the ignominy of such deaths. Clement, writing about 30 years later, gives an account of his martyrdom outside the walls of Rome. He appears before Nero the first time. The emperor then was about 29, a handsome face, but blotched and disfigured by lust and alcohol. From the same causes his body was too corpulent for the spindle legs on which it stood. With him were the jurors, all of proconsular and propraetorial rank. To each were given 3 white tablets, on one of which was written A for acquittal, on another C for condemnation, and on the third an L for non-liquid, not proven. For his letter to Timothy, we learn that at this prima actio, Paul had no patronus to encourage him, no advocatus to plead for him, no deprecator to say a word in his favor. Alone he stood at the bar before that wild beast who thirsted daily for blood. Yet he gained the day. The fierce stare relaxed, the bloodshot eyes softened, the lustful mouth gave vent to words that led the trembling jurors hastily to drop the tablet marked A into the circling urn. Once more it was a marvelous deliverance. The Jews once again were balked of their prey. Nero was not to condemn Paul. But not for long did he escape. Nero was singing and dancing through Acacia, having left a freedman, Helius, in his place. And as early tradition places the apostles' martyrdom on the 29th of June in 66, it was before him that he was brought at his second trial. As he told Timothy, "I was delivered out of the lion's mouth." But as after events proved, it was only to be played with. So at his second trial in Nero's absence, Paul was condemned. No long time elapsed between his condemnation and his decapitation. The place we know, just outside the walls, about 2 miles along the road to Ostia. There stood in Paul's day a pyramid. It was a monument erected to the memory of Caius Cestius, and over his remains by L. Pontius Mela, a kinsman of Pontius Pilate. There are now many monuments in that little hollow. The pyramid stands no longer alone. It is the burial place of our countrymen and women who die at Rome. Early in the morning, the jailer wakes the sleeping apostle, and so one would fancy, like that Argyle whom his bitter enemy found sleeping like an infant on the morn of his execution, and fled the castle to a kinswoman's house the other side of the parade ground yonder at Edinburgh, exclaiming, "Would I were like that man, for Christians know how to die." Forth they sped on their 3 miles' march. Doubtless some of the loungers in the praetorium went to see the end. The beams of the rising sun touched the points of the soldiers' weapons with living fire. Thus tramping along with martial tread, with jingling of accoutrements and occasional gruff words of command, the little procession, slowly growing in size, would meet a motley throng of travelers towards Rome. Merchants hastening with their bills of lading to secure the markets, sailors fresh from long voyages, for Ostia was a seaport, rolling along to spend their wages amidst the haunts of horrid vice and sudden death in the great barracks that had sprung up after the fire, where swarmed the poor of Rome like obscene insects under great stones. Dancing girls from the east with gaily painted turbans, officials returning from the seats of their government to give an account of themselves at headquarters, Chaldean astrologers and shaven Egyptian priests with their distinctive dress and tonsured crowns. Then all the rage with the smart set of Rome, these and many more met the escort of death. So at length the grassy mound that heaves its rounds form above the common level of the surrounding turf is reached. The homeless man, alone, yet accompanied by heaven's triumphant hosts. Oh, if it be possible for these glorious beings to entertain envy within their breasts, 'tis now, for earth finds not so grand a moment, so rich a pageant, as when the least of the human race dies for Jesus, kneels down at the place appointed, commends his spirit to his never-failing friend, whose words he still remembers, "Fear not, because I am with thee, and no one shall set on thee to do thee hurt." The great sun suddenly boils over the brim of the world, a sign, a sigh, a moment's flash, a sullen thud, a crimson stain spreading fast, obliterating the green, and the new face is before the throne. The greatest of the Lord's servants has reached home at last, but the Lord's work remains unfinished. Thus we have neither the death of Peter nor of Paul recorded in the Word. Doubtless this autumn you have been north. Your favorite view is where a great crag raises its lofty head above the still waters of the lake. It is covered from head to foot with a beautiful garment of foliage, and as autumn's fingers would rend its robe, it blushes. Thus the green robe has become a gorgeous vesture dipped in blood. Presently winter will come, and with resolute hands rub the vestment threadbare until nothing is left but the gray crag glooming through ragged threads that cling around it. The leaves have gone, to come again, but the rock remains. Thus the teachers whom we love, the saintly men and women whose lives spoke louder than their lips, the men of larger faith and massive knowledge, the Muellers, the Chapmans, the Wrights, the Vickers, the 3 Henrys, Henry Groves, Henry Dyer, Henry Heath, have gone, and the despairing cry rings through the chambers of our souls, my Father, the chariot of Israel and the horsemen thereof. Is the work finished? No. Then be sure that until the work be finished, he whose work it is remains. Jesus, the same yesterday and today and forever. Paul died? Never. He lived on in the love and lives of the men and women to whom he had brought the best boon of all, the knowledge of this same Jesus. Longinus, Acestus, Megistus were 3 of the escort. Longinus, Acestus, Megistus themselves ere long marched to death for Christ. For the indomitable spirit of Paul the Apostle, aforetime Saul the persecutor, had in the hour of death still pointed souls to Jesus, and 3 at least of the instruments of persecution, following the direction, had found Jesus, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Amen.